Hey, everybody. I'm Ryan Ashley Anderson, commonly known as Ray, and I have here with me today Allie Chamberlain of Reclaim Creative, a really talented craftsperson who gives quilts a second life with her incredible clothing design. So, Allie, thank you for being here with me today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah, definitely. I would love for you to just kind of introduce yourself, talk a little bit about what you do, so people can learn about what Reclaim Creative is all about.
Yeah, so I'm Allie. I am 24 and live in Knoxville, Tennessee, and the owner and sole woman running this show called Reclaim Creative. Um, my journey has been super nonlinear in a lot of ways, but I'm a trained architect. I've worked for multiple architecture firms, but have learned so much about the clothing industry. And I also come from a long line of rural Appalachian and Western Kentucky quilters. So all of those things kind of merged a lot of passions together. And now I'm running Reclaim Creative full time as my business and repurposing forgotten, unwanted, or discarded textiles. Right now, mostly focusing on quilts that are being tossed and creating beautiful, dignified works of art for your body or your home.
I love that. I love the dignified works of art because at least for many of us, when I think of the pieces that I take to Goodwill or the thrift or whatever, there's this process of discarding things that in a way can feel, undignified or like
Mhm.
this is now just going away. And so to give those textiles a new life is incredible. And so much care goes into the creation of a quilt anyway from the beginning that I think it's
Yeah.
very fitting, no pun intended, very fitting that you're using this particular type of textile to create these garments.
Yeah, and it wasn't something that I initially put together or thought of, like, specifically, like, I want to use quilts, but, my friends and I actually co-owned when I was in college a secondhand or, like, repurposed textile and clothing shop here in Knoxville called Bare Thread,
Oh,
and
I remember hearing about that actually.
yeah, so I was a
Very
part of
cool.
that when I was started out my freshman year of college. They were all a lot older than me, or they still are. But that's kind of what sparked everything. And we were just taking items that were donated to us. And if it was in great shape, we wanted to curate it to create affordable, nice secondhand clothing. But if it wasn't in good shape, we repurposed everything. So we kind of had like the art side to it and like the repurpose side, but also just like the secondhand curated shop that was basically reframing the way you look at discarded textiles. But all that to say, I originally started in that way, and it wasn't until I was working on my architectural thesis project in my fifth year of school in a 5-year program where I was thinking about identity and space and also garments, because garments are the way that you are one way that you portray your identity. And that's like a decision you make every single day. Like, how am I going to portray myself to the world? So that was the first time I made a quilt coat because I took a family quilt that was like passed down through generations with permission from my grandmas and my mom, um, and turned it into a coat to like start to study identity and portrayal of our identities to the world. And then I was like, wait, so many quilts are discarded and so many are completely falling apart. And there's just a lack of value or understanding of what goes into a quilt and how beautiful it is and how amazing it is. So that's kind of what led to all of this happening now, which is just wild.
When you do shows like craft fairs, for example, do you find people asking you a lot about the origin of the quilts you use?
Yes, the biggest, well, in a way, yes. In a way, everyone is like, where do you find your quilts?
Mm,
And that's the question I get the most, which is really hard because I'm like, everywhere and nowhere is
yeah.
my most common answer because I'm like, I could go for days looking for quilts and never find them, and then some days I find like 10 quilts.
Oh, wow.
So that's one part of it, but as far as origin, like the origin stories of like the families they came from and everything, people do ask me that, but with quilts, if you don't find it directly from the family member or it's not documented within the quilt, which sometimes it is, it's
Oh, really?
really hard to trace origins. Yeah. So I recently made a quilt coat that had the year that it was created and the initials of the person embroidered into it.
Oh, wow.
Or I've been using this quilt as like a really beautiful tablecloth at events. And I was at markets like every weekend. And then I looked and I was like, it had the year, it had the city it was made, and it had initials of someone,
Oh,
but it took
wow.
me that long to find it because sometimes it's like super
Very
hidden.
good.
So it's like these hidden treasures all the time, which is just really fun
Kind of
and
like an
like
artist signature.
yeah.
Wow. Have you ever, when you're taking apart, cutting apart a quilt, have you ever found anything within the quilt? I've always wondered about that because, there's these layers and in the batting, I don't know, I feel like you could find secret treasures.
Yeah, so yes and no. In one quilt instance, I've found something, but it's actually really interesting because we also renovate houses. We're landlords,
Oh,
and in houses we found like underneath, like one time we ripped up 9 layers of flooring, and there were newspapers from the 1930s that people leave as like a momentum of like when it was built. But that's a side note.
wow.
So a quilt I was working on, it was from my grandma's house. It was passed down from her great grandma, so I guess my great great grandma. And my mom was like, "Please don't use this quilt for anyone else. I want a coat out of it for Christmas." And I was like, "Okay." So I started cutting into it because my grandma didn't want it anymore. She didn't like it, and my mom was like, "Okay, let's use it." And I saw this orange, and I was like, it was just one solid let me grab it really quickly. I
Oh,
can show.
yeah, please do.
So it was just one solid piece of fabric. Like the whole thing was just this green,
Okay.
which is really abnormal for a quilt. Which is why my grandma was like, cut it up. I don't care. It's one piece.
Hmm.
Well, I started looking underneath and so I saw like some orange. And underneath this entire thing, if you can see, is a whole nother quilt.
Oh my gosh.
So what one thing that's pretty fascinating is that my family was most of the generations of my family have been like just like very blue collar, worked multiple jobs, and the way that they made quilts was super utilitarian. Like take old fabric, take old clothes, let's make something to keep us warm.
Hmm.
Which isn't the story for everyone, but especially like in the southeast, that's pretty common in more rural areas.
Yeah.
And so this just shows like the quilt got tattered, it was falling apart. It was like plant died from the probably late 1800s.
Wow.
And then they just sewed another piece of fabric on it to keep using it. So it was like,
Wow.
it's pretty amazing. And the fact that it came from my own family was like so cool, but it is so tattered and like really crumbling. So when I made my mom the coat, we continued to make it and then just put a patch of the original quilt inside like the back of it
Oh,
as a way to kind of frame it because you can't use the other part because it's like crumbling.
yeah,
But that's been the coolest story. And the fact that it came from my own family and we could trace down like who it came from when it was made was pretty cool.
that's amazing. What a
Yeah.
cool story about, this like generational, I don't know, it's like part heirloom and part story, part, and there's just so much history there, especially thinking about like what you said, the Southeast and Appalachia and how, what we think of as fine craft today.
Hmm.
So, quilting, pottery, I mean, there's so many different things I could mention were really functions of poverty for
Hmm.
most people for generations and generations. We need a blanket to keep warm. We need
Right.
things to eat out of. And I think it's so cool how we're able to take those skills and those crafts and create, choose to use those to create
Mhm.
beautiful pieces of art to enjoy and also use. They
Mhm.
also have functions still, obviously, but
Oh,
um,
for sure. That's one
yeah.
interesting thing about quilts is there's so many levels to it. Like there's a huge debate in the quilt world right now of whether or not you should be cutting up quilts.
Mm.
And some people think that they should all be in museums. And I've talked to my family about it, who are like, grew up making quilts and everything. And they're like, the thing is, Allie, there were people who made museum worthy quilts. And that was typically more wealthy. They could preserve them. They were made of really fine materials, and it was more of a fine art and
Mhm.
like a social club for them.
Mm.
And for my family, it was more utility pretty much. And there is a social part of it and there is a craft to it for sure, but basically like what I learned from my grandma and my great grandma was like not all quilts were created equally, and each of them like tells a story of a family, of a social class, of history, and everyone regarded different quilts differently.
Yeah.
And so it's just fascinating really to just learn about it.
Well, and I love from sort of an anthropological perspective, the way that you could look at, look from one quilt to the other and learn so much about the person who made it because of the quality of
Mhm.
the thread or
Yeah.
the weave of the textiles used.
Mhm.
And for that purpose, I totally understand, like, just seeing a show or thinking of a museum that really
Yeah.
is documenting different kinds of people from different places and also regional differences.
Yeah.
Like, I'm sure the textiles range from, warmer climates to much colder climates.
Mhm.
Um, I went to a quilt museum and it was in Kentucky. I think it
Paducah,
was.
Kentucky, the quilt capital of the world.
Yes, yes.
That's where my
And
grandma lives.
it was amazing. And I also recently watched a quilt. It was like a mini documentary. It was part of this film festival. I wish I could call up the name. And it talked so much about community, and especially in more rural communities, the idea that this is an activity that you could build community around. And it
Mhm.
wasn't a club so much as it was like women specifically getting together to kind of share resources, share
Yeah.
stories, do something together that was, low or no cost. And yeah, I just think it's amazing.
Mhm. I remember growing up, my grandma was in like a quilting club, and so we would stay at her house for a few weeks in the summer, and we would be like dragged to the quilting club with all the old ladies, and they're all sitting there quilting and talking,
Yeah.
and we're just like, oh, quilts. Like, I mean, now I have a much greater appreciation for quilts, but I was like, this is such a grandma thing. But
Yeah.
it was like that was like what their friend group did, and that's what brought them together. And they often like auctioned them off and donated them, and it was like,
That's
I don't know,
cool.
it's really cool. Yeah.
It reminds me of the knitting circles I've been a part of over the
Oh,
years.
cool.
Yeah, so I've been knitting since I was like 8, and I started teaching knitting and working at knitting shops when I was 16.
Oh, sweet.
So I was like always working with just so many different kinds of people, the economy knitter, the luxury
Mhm.
knitter, the young
Yeah.
knitter, the old knitter, male, female, everything in between. And yeah, it's so interesting to see the different ways people engage with the craft based on like what their purpose is and what their background is.
Mhm.
So, have you made a quilt?
I've done little quilts. And at some point, one of my goals is to do like a quilt a day series. I keep saying it, and I'm like, I just need to do it. But basically, like collage type quilt. I've been reading this book called The Uncommon Quilter.
Oh,
And it basically is just like
I'm writing that down.
daily documentation, collage, montage in quilting, which I think is really fascinating because it's like your own spin and collection of memories in quilting.
Yeah.
Um, Anyways, that's something I really want to do, but for me, I mean, I appreciate quilts so much, but my attention span is like maybe that would be a really great challenge for me is like finish one big quilt because it's really hard for me to finish like a huge crazy project like that because I get
Right.
so distracted, but one day.
Yeah, I can relate to that. I mean, as we were talking about before we pressed record, the attention span is an issue.
Big time.
Have you ever thought about a group quilt? Like sent, everybody working on their own little square and then maybe
Yeah.
assembling it?
Yeah, there's actually an artist here who is collecting squares right now, and I'm about to start working on one. It's a log cabin quilt. I can't remember what she's doing with it, but it's a log cabin community quilt.
What does that mean?
Log cabin?
Like, yeah, what's a log cabin quilt?
Oh, log cabin is the block pattern. So it starts with like a square and then it has like rectangles going out of it.
Oh, yeah, okay. Sort of like logs being stacked.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. That's really interesting. I didn't know that, but of course it would. I'm sure every traditional pattern has its own name and origin.
Yeah, a lot of them, and I'm still learning a lot for sure. But that's another interesting thing is there's some patterns that have multiple names depending on different groups of people that
Mhm.
have worked with it or you ask about. But most, especially there's a few really, really typical ones that most people know like the same name for them.
Gotcha.
Um, but there's some, people just make up random ones too, and they probably don't have an official name.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense.
Mhm.
So where do you usually find your quilts? You said you can go on and on looking and never find them, but is it usually thrift stores?
No, it's not usually thrift stores.
Okay.
A lot of times there's estate sales that have really old quilts that are falling apart. And I'll usually get those because oftentimes if someone else doesn't buy them, they'll literally throw them in the dumpster
Mhm.
at the end of an estate sale. Um, and then there's also I recently started working with this guy who works in I think they call it a rag house. And basically all of the stuff that's essentially being discarded from thrift stores because so much is donated to thrift stores and
Yeah.
so much leaves thrift stores and doesn't even get sold that ends up
Right.
one either in the landfill or in a foreign country being sold off, which can destroy
Really?
the local economy. Yeah. And so the rag house is kind of a middle ground where they take all of the discarded materials and bundle them kind of like in hay bales, but
Hmm.
clothing bales. And oftentimes they will sell those to people before sending them to the landfill or another country. And so I've been working with this guy who actually gets about 5 to 10 quilts a week that are about to go to the landfill, and they haven't had anyone interested in buying them from this specific place. So hopefully I'm able to start working with him. We have to figure out the shipping logistics and stuff.
Where is he
Um,
located?
well, he's in Minnesota.
Oh.
Um, so I would love to find someone close by that I could meet up with and figure that out because quilts are heavy and a lot to ship, but otherwise they're going straight to the landfill or another country. So that would be that's the next step. But for now, mostly estate sales and I mean, there's some people on Facebook Marketplace who are selling old tattered quilts and I usually talk to them. But then a lot of the custom work I do, people are sending in their quilts as well.
Okay. So if somebody had quilts and has been thinking, I want somewhere to send these, but I don't want to just throw them away or send them to a thrift store, do you
Mhm.
take donations directly? Like if people wanted to ship you quilts?
Yeah, if someone wants to do that, that would be amazing.
Okay, so they
I
should just
actually,
message you, right?
what's that?
They should just message you.
Yeah, for sure. That
Okay,
would be amazing.
cool.
Recently, a woman reached out because I didn't think about that, and a woman was like, "I was literally about to take all of my quilts to the thrift store, and honestly, I even thought about taking them to the dump. But then I saw your reel. Would you want them?" And I was like, "Don't take them to the dump."
That's amazing.
So yeah, if someone is really wanting to discard some quilts, I will
Okay.
gladly work with them.
Okay, awesome. And then if somebody wanted to obviously see your work and purchase a garment from you, do you ever do custom work with people who maybe they want to use a quilt they already have or they have
Mhm.
certain pieces they want? Okay, awesome.
Yeah, I'll show you this quilt I'm working with right now that someone sent me.
Oh my
It is
gosh.
like, when I say this quilt is in bad shape, I mean this quilt is in bad shape.
Whoa.
And it's been in her family since she was a child, and she knew it's to the point where she basically needs to get rid of it. So I'm working with that right now, actually, and combining it with another quilt that's also in bad shape but a little more stable.
Mhm.
I can show you that quilt coat
Yeah,
too if you
please.
want to see it.
Yeah,
But so
definitely.
that's a really cool example of someone who has this in their family who wants to like find new purpose for it.
Mm,
So The bottom half is the blue one, and the top half is another one that
Is
she's
that
sent
a
me.
pocket? Is there a pocket on that quilt? Oh wait, that's a
Yeah.
jacket.
Oh
Oh.
yeah, sorry. This is a jacket.
Oh, that's beautiful.
Yeah.
Wow.
Oh, that's a really cool example of like someone had a super tattered quilt that they were attached to and they wanted it to keep living on. So
Wow.
yeah, I try to work with as much custom projects as possible. It's a lot to keep up with, but it's worth it to me.
That's really
So
cool. I'm curious to know, so you mentioned the sort of capstone project you did as part of your architecture program around identity, the thing that led to Reclaim Creative. What did you find? Like,
in terms of my thesis project,
yeah.
well, so funnily enough, the quilt coat was just a very minor initial study part of the thesis project. And this is a whole nother conversation I could really go into. But basically, my whole thesis was exploring identity in neighborhoods, and how basically I was looking at grassroots architecture and activism, and flipping the narrative of a top-down approach to like capital A architecture, as they call it, to a more community-driven um, way of going about design.
Sure.
So first, it started with garments and identity, and just studying like different communities and the portrayal of identity through garments, and then moved towards the scale of the building and the scale of studying how different people project the identity of the neighborhood, um, in the building space. But I that was so that was when we lived down like a few miles that way in East Knoxville. And we lived in this neighborhood called Burlington, which you might be familiar with
I
actually. And
actually, so the home that I had in Knoxville, well, I just sold it a few weeks ago actually, but was in
congrats.
East Knoxville. So
Oh, cool.
yeah, it was
I
like
love East
half a
Knoxville.
mile from that little tiny downtown area.
Burlington?
Is it? I don't even know what it was called actually. Maybe it was. It was right off of the exit. Um,
Yeah, by the zoo.
yeah.
Yeah, so that's where I lived.
Oh, okay. Well,
Um,
that's where I
and
lived.
that's so wild. Well,
Yeah. I
so
lived right by Skyline Park, like right next to Skyline Park.
no way. Okay, so you know where that downtown area is,
Yeah.
and then there's the big church with the big parking lot. We
Yep.
were two houses down from the parking lot.
Oh my gosh. I miss driving through there because there are a couple of those places where you couldn't really tell, is there a business still happening inside? Like the one, was it like Diva's barber shop or something, or Ed's bar? And it
Yeah.
was great.
Well, there were three barber shops, and only one of them is still there. So my whole thesis project was on all of this.
Oh wow.
And
Okay. Well, I need to read your thesis, I feel like now.
yeah, I'll find it and send it to you because I was basically interviewing all of my neighbors, some of which who had been there from since the 70s when it was still a predominantly white neighborhood,
Hmm.
and just talking about like the social consequences of everything that happened in urban renewal and the interstate and all the things. And basically how does it was a huge community core, and then it was abandoned and neglected, and like how
Sure.
does abandonment and neglect and lack of ownership start to reflect or inform identity. And so basically I was trying to like flip the narrative of like bringing life back into buildings.
Yeah.
So the quilts led to that.
Wow.
But I can send you that. We can talk about it another time.
Yeah, I love that. I'm curious. So the garments that you make now out of these quilts, this is the thing that you do, right? This is your niche. You're not creating garments out of anything else. Is that right?
In the summertime, I I have some like vintage bedspreads,
Oh, cool.
or sheets, and also like, do you know what chenille is?
Yeah,
Okay, so
I
I
do.
also make like shirts and tank tops out of chenille, but
That's
I
amazing.
mean, the qu- I found for me running a business by myself as like one person, I was so scattered. Like every week was working on like, oh, I'm going to develop this shirt or this jacket, and I had to like narrow things down and focus on one thing. So I basically pouring all of my focus into quilt coats because I want to do one thing really well.
Yeah.
And concisely instead of, oh, today I'm doing this and this and this and this,
Yes.
because it's really hard for people to understand what I'm doing, number one. But it was also very chaotic for me to feel kind of like grounded or like I was doing something well, if that makes sense. So
Oh
I
yeah.
love to do other work, but right now I am focusing on quilts because that helps me and that helps other people understand what I'm working on.
Well, it makes perfect sense. I mean, I think, when I think of brands that are really large and well known now, for example, Nike is a huge, expansive company now, and it's like everything athletics, right? But in the very beginning, it's like you gain your recognition by doing one thing really well, and that's
Mhm.
something I struggled when I was, making full time. So my primary focus was like textile jewelry, so hand stitched beadwork. I did a lot of knitting with gemstones and like silk cord and things like that. And I really struggled between like wanting to play as an artist and a designer and explore other ways of being creative, of making things, and
Mhm.
but then also creating this concise, collection that was easy to talk about, easy to market, easy to understand, because that is the way we shop. We go to a clothing store. We don't want to go to a store that has, hardware and shoes and, everything else.
Confusing. Yeah.
Yeah. And so I think that for makers and creatives, I think it's really important to think about, approaching, especially a newer business, with a little bit of a single-minded focus around what is the thing that you're doing for people that other people aren't doing for those
Mhm.
people.
Yeah, or even like I've struggled with like, well, there are other people doing similar things, but
Mm,
focusing on like, well, how are you doing it differently?
yes, the
Uh,
differentiation.
yeah, and that's been really encouraging. But yeah, I've totally had the same struggles and I still have the same struggles. Like I always want to do everything all at once.
Yeah.
But one and I can still do like I still help people build their websites and do branding, and I'm currently helping a family redesign their home and their landscape, and like I do those things because I thrive a bit more when I am multifaceted,
Yep.
but I don't have to market those things to everyone.
Sure.
So if it's still good for me to, and I have to learn how to say no to a lot of things, which I'm
Yeah.
also working on. But if someone approaches me with a project and it's exciting to me and I want to work with them and it's within my skill set, I've learned like, okay, you don't have to market it because that could be
Yeah,
confusing to everyone else.
exactly.
And but you can do it if it's something that will help balance you or be enjoyable, or just like take a break from the sewing machine sometimes because
Yeah.
sometimes my back hurts.
Yeah, I get
So
that.
yeah, it's a weird journey, and I definitely think as a maker, as an artist, as a person who wants to be creative, all of this started because I made something. Reclaim Creative actually started with bookmaking. And I was making that for fun originally
Yeah,
for myself. And then other people wanted it. And I was in college and I was like, I could use some money for food.
sure.
And so
Eating
I
is
made,
good,
I
right?
actually have one right here that I kept for myself, but I was using like repurposed textiles from clothing companies that were like cutting their fabric and had waste essentially. Um, and that started because I liked doing it. And then it became like a business. And I think finding that balance of like, this is what I do for work, but this is what I do for play is really hard when they can seem to be the same thing.
Yes.
But what I'm trying to work on, I'm not doing a good job of it, but is like setting aside time to rest and play on the weekends and the evenings and setting stricter boundaries with my work schedule so that
Yeah.
I still allow time to do those things. And then it makes my business better too, because I'm doing things that I enjoy and it can maybe
That fill
bring
you.
in a new product or yeah, or whatever. Yeah, exactly. Maybe it doesn't have to be business centered. Maybe it can just be for fun, which is just
Yeah.
hard sometimes.
I found that since I, left the full-time maker world, people ask me all the time, are you ever planning on going back to it? You ever planning on going back to jewelry? And it's like, well, it's not that I'm left being, I'm still who I am. I'm still a
Mhm.
maker. These things are still important to me. I still find my identity through craft in a lot of ways, but I don't personally see myself commodifying it in the way that I did before. So
Yeah.
I have a knitting project that I started over the summer, and it's supposedly an Afghan, right? But now it's 7 months, 8 months later, and I think I've gotten this far on it. And it's the kind of thing where I feel no pressure, no deadlines. I feel only like this like sort of meditative, joyful feeling when I'm working on it.
Right.
And I don't have any feelings around, oh, I've got to knit 10 rows a day, or, I'm not making progress, because it's just not the way at least today, not the way I'm looking at my practice. But I think like you, I still occasionally finish something. I made someone a hat for Christmas, so there you go.
Nice.
Or I'll occasionally make myself a piece of jewelry, or a friend will reach out for, a custom piece for someone they care about. And I'm not marketing that. I'm not going out there saying, get in touch for custom work, but it's still, it's still in me. So
and it probably will never leave, because that's like something that is so exciting to you and like a part of you.
Yeah.
It's the way that you do it can look different.
Exactly. Okay. So one woman, craftsperson, business owner, what, like on a day-to-day basis, what do you feel like kind of your favorite and least favorite parts of that are? Like, what are the parts that are really hard, kind of doing it all your own? And what are the parts that feel really freeing and liberating and exciting?
Well, a quick, easy answer would be the part that feels freeing and exciting is doing it all by myself. And a part that feels horrible is doing it all by myself. But specifically, like having the freedom to just kind of lay my pattern on a quilt and move it around and like decide, how is this going to look? How is this going to come together, is really fun for me. And just like piecing together how things can come about, I think is really fun. And really, any interaction with people, I'm like, I love people so much, and I'm like extremely extroverted, and so anything with people is super exciting. And like getting to know the stories of quilts and people is one of my favorite things.
That's awesome.
And then one of the hardest parts by myself, and I'm actually like, I never want to say it out loud, but I'm getting to the point where hiring would be a really great option for me. The hardest part, I think, is not being able to say yes to everything all the time, because I don't have the capacity. And so I would love to figure out what capacities are good to outsource, maybe. Like, for example, taking photos of products and making product listings on my website. I'm like, this takes forever and it kind of gets annoying after a while, but it has to be done. So stuff like that, it's just like tedious, but sometimes I love it too, because it's just part of the process. So there's a vague answer, I guess.
It can be nice. I found that when I would go through periods of just spending hours every day just making, sometimes it was nice to take a break and work on something that was sort of didn't pull from my creative well. Bookkeeping for me was the thing that was like, even if I only have 10 transactions a month,
Taxes.
Oh, the numbers of it, it's like, I've had a bookkeeper now for like 6 or 7 years, and it's hard to find a good one. I'll say that.
That's the thing. Yeah, I do all of that by myself right now.
They're all better than me, though. I'll say that. No matter how bad the bookkeeper is, they're going to be better than I am.
That's fair. I will say I just invested. I have the ugliest, most inefficient spreadsheet of all time that I made. And my husband, he's so great at Excel. He's like, let me help you. I'm like, no, this works. But I actually just invested in a small business bookkeeping spreadsheet where I export everything from Squarespace and just plop it in there.
Awesome.
And that is making everything a lot easier, because I like to like learn it myself, and that helps me learn it.
Yeah.
But then when it comes to like taxes, I'm just like, okay, I need to hire someone now.
Oh yeah. Yeah, I don't do my own taxes. Another thing I don't do bookkeeping, I don't do taxes.
Good for you.
I mean, and I'm sure that anyone I try to work with is probably like, oh my God, she really could never do this herself, because they ask me for something like, hey, what are these expenses? And like a month later, I'll be like, I'm so sorry. Here's they're itemized now, finally. I'm just so that kind of work. I think too, I had to really ask myself, which things make me like leave me feeling really empty. And me looking through numbers and itemizing transactions and like balancing the books, just the process. I just bit my tongue while I was talking. That was awkward. Just the process of, I have trouble with numbers anyway, like some minor kind of dyslexia stuff. And so I have this like fear inside that I think comes from my school days of being in class and being like, I know how to do this. I wrote a 9 instead of a 4. I wrote a 3 instead, and so just like the stress of being in class and getting it wrong. And now I still carry that with me. And it's like, you know what, I would rather pay money to these people to do this and like make other sacrifices because
well, that makes your business better too, because you're letting someone who's a professional do that thing that normally would like hinder you from doing things that are more impactful for your business.
Exactly.
So good for you for doing that. That's maybe one of my next steps, because I'm like,
I highly recommend. I highly recommend it. Okay, so I want to ask just like 1 or 2 more things, and then we'll sign off here. One thing being, like, what is something that you face in sort of shaping this business that you have now, Reclaim Creative, where maybe there was a moment of doubt, or you kept coming against a wall, or you felt like, I just don't know kind of how to go from here to where I want to be. Is there anything like that you can speak to and maybe give some insights on how you kind of like push through that?
Yeah. I think one interesting thing is I started out with bookmaking and watercolors because that was something that people asked me to do. And that was something that paid. And I was like, okay. But it wasn't something that I felt strongly about, which made me like not resentful, but just like it just made it a big struggle. And so one thing that I was like, I love making clothing. I love making garments. I think this is what I want to do.
Yeah.
But I had this kind of internal struggle with that where I was like, well, that's not what people want. And I am like, I don't know if you know the Enneagram, but I'm Enneagram 3, and I'm just like outwardly driven. And so like if other people want it, I'm gonna do it.
Like people
But
pleaser
I have
kind
to
of?
like, what's that?
Like people pleaser kind of?
Big time.
Yeah.
And I was like, what do I want to do and what is exciting to me? But making that transition was really hard because the price point is completely different. The customer is completely different. But I'm so much more excited about what I do every single day. And I just decided to do it. And one way that helped me do that is educating people on the value. And so I was like, this is why this is valuable. And this is like the story of this quilt. And this is like taken me so much time and, just like talking about the value. And I think that's been really exciting because I think people see the quilt coats and they understand why it's valuable. And I think they could tell someone else, like, this is why it costs this much because it's valuable because of this. And I'm like, yes. But my hope is that they will also think that about every other garment that they purchase from anyone else. And so I think that was kind of a pivotal thing. It's just like, what do I want to do? And am I willing to like completely change audiences, price points, everything for what I think I am more gifted and more called to be doing on a daily basis? So that was one thing. Even just starting Reclaim Creative full time was a whole nother struggle. I've been fighting it for a while. And it was just like doing better and better and better. But I was like, this is not what I should do. I'm an academic. I studied architecture. Like, I need to work in a firm. And long story short, I was working in a firm, crying on the way to work, crying at work, crying on the way home. And my husband's like, Allie, you are allowed to quit your job and you are allowed to do something you didn't get a degree in. And my mental health was so bad that it just pushed me to the point of being like, this is my only option. I have to do it and I have to make it work. And that's been another hard thing, but it has been great.
Well, I think that's so important. I'm so glad you shared that because I think many of us are conditioned to think that, okay, I pick a thing that I want to do. I go to school for that thing, and there's this value associated with that education, whether it's, sort of traditional college or trade school or apprenticeship or whatever it is, self
Right.
teaching. But there's a value associated with that time and money and all of that investment.
Yeah.
That there's almost this like internal. I mean, I've experienced it too of like, but I paid for that, or
Mm-hmm.
I spent time pursuing that, so I need to now get something back from it.
Mm-hmm.
But so often what we end up doing, we wouldn't have gotten to that if it hadn't been for this other thing. Like you're talking about this project you did as part of your program, which in part led to what you're doing now.
Mm-hmm.
And okay, so maybe you're not working full-time as an architect, but like look at what you have,
Right. Right.
amazing.
And that's a good reminder. And for me, because I really care like what people think, and I always do my best to like
Mhm.
be the best I can. I excelled in academia and I did really well, and I realized that going and getting a higher education degree is such a privilege. And
Mhm.
I'm like, if I was good at it and gifted and able to do it, who am I to neglect that?
I
Um,
appreciate that.
and that's been really hard, because I just feel like I'm in this place of privilege and I shouldn't be. But instead, I have been trying to think like, well, I have been gifted with all of these things, and like this is doing well for a reason and it is needed. And that is equally as valuable as sitting in a firm 50 hours a week. And like my education probably taught me equally about each,
Yeah.
really. So it's just hard to fight what our culture tells us is the right thing to be doing, and like this linear lifestyle, like high school, higher ed, post grad, whatever, work in a firm for the rest of your life until you retire. And fighting what culture expects you to do and thinks you should be doing can be really hard, but
Yeah.
it feels rewarding for now.
That's awesome.
So
So happy for you.
thanks. I'm learning a lot.
Yeah. I bet. Well, we're going to start to wrap up here. And I just wonder, is there anything we haven't talked about that you want to speak to? Any little nugget you'd like to share before we sign off? It's your time to do that.
Yeah, I just think like what I wish someone would have told me.
Mhm.
So I guess for anyone listening or watching this, it's okay for your life to change, and it's okay to make a pivot that you didn't plan for, and it's okay to not know what it's going to look like in the future. I think I felt, not by my family, but maybe just like in the institution in general or academia in general, I just felt like there was this path that I needed to follow in order to be doing the right thing.
Mm.
But now that my life feels so much more nonlinear and there doesn't seem to be like a perfectly clear path set out for the rest of my life, like I feel like I'm walking where I need to be.
Mhm.
So I think just like it's okay to pivot, and it's okay to quit a job if you need to, if you can, and it's okay to try something new, and it's okay to fail. So that's something I would share, because I mean I've gone through all those things and I thought they were all wrong, and they've all led to huge learning experiences, a lot of fulfillment, and like just more joy in general, which is great.
That's amazing. Well, thank you so much for sharing a bit of your
Yeah,
story, and talking about Reclaim Creative. And I'm just really
thanks for
excited to share
having
this with everybody. Yeah, of course. I'm excited to share this with everybody. It'll go up in a few weeks. I'll share, all of the details around that. And of course, links for how people can get in touch with you, explore
me.
your
Oh,
quilts, purchase from you. And yeah, just thank you so much for your time. I'm really grateful.
yeah, it's been fun. I love to talk, so
I love
I'm,
it.
yeah, I could talk forever.
Awesome. I know I went sometimes I get into these chats and I'm like, how long should they be? And I don't have a time limit. Some are, I think one was like 15 minutes, another one was 30 minutes. This one's closer to an hour. Um, and I just really love that, that it's able to be sort of an organic its own living, breathing thing each time. So thank you.
That's awesome.
Yeah. Cool. Well, thank you again. And I will talk to you soon. And
Cool.
for everybody watching this, just check out the captions for links, details, tags, how to get in touch with Allie, how to talk to me if you know someone who wants to be interviewed or you want to be interviewed. Not really interviewed, we're just chatting. But anyway, have a great day and I'll talk to you soon.
Cool.